If you grew up in Quebec, or anywhere in the Northeast, on either side of the border, there's a chance the school bus that picked you up on winter mornings carried a Corbeil smiley face on its roof, grinning down through the dark as you climbed the steps with your breath freezing in the air. Behind that emblem was a single factory in St-Lin-Laurentides that built one in every 5 short school buses sold in North America. They survived being bought by an American giant that shut the factory down. Survived starting over with 77 buses in a shuttered plant. Survived 20 years of competing against manufacturers 10 times their size on their own continent. And then, after 70 years of putting children on the road from a village most Canadians couldn't find on a map, the factory went quiet for the last time. How does a company that already came back from the dead simply disappear? What happened? Chapter 1. The Tobacco Town. The story begins not in a factory, but in a field. Specifically, in the tobacco and dairy country of the Lanaudière, about 40 kilometers north of Montreal, where the village of St-Lin sat in the 1930s the way it had sat for generations. Quietly, modestly, surrounded by farmland that froze hard in October and didn't thaw until April. This was not industrial Quebec. The textile mills were in Magog and Sherbrooke. The shipyards were in Lévis and Sorel. St-Lin grew tobacco. It raised hogs. It shipped milk to the dairies closer to the city. Its one claim to national significance was that Sir Wilfrid Laurier, Canada's first French-Canadian Prime Minister, had been born there in 1841, a fact commemorated by a national historic site that drew a modest trickle of visitors each summer and meant nothing at all to the men working the surrounding farms. In 1936, a man named Joseph-Henri Corbeil opened a shop in St-Lin to build truck bodies. The timing tells you something about the man. This was the Depression. Quebec's economy was predominantly agricultural, and the agriculture was struggling. The province's manufacturing sector, such as it was, remained overwhelmingly controlled by Anglophone capital. English-speaking owners in Montreal and Toronto, financing factories where French-Canadian workers took instructions in a language that wasn't theirs. A Francophone entrepreneur starting a manufacturing business in a village of a few hundred people in that economic climate was not following a playbook. He was improvising. Joseph-Henri Corbeil wasn't building complete trucks. He was building the bodies that sat on commercial chassis, the wooden and steel structures that turned a bare frame into something that could carry goods or people. It was skilled work, closer to coach building than to assembly line manufacturing, and it required a working knowledge of metalwork, carpentry, and the particular demands of Quebec roads, which in the 1930s ranged from poor to non-existent once you left the main highways. His shop was small. His workforce was local. His customers were regional. The pivot came within a few years of founding. By about 1940, the date is approximate. French language reporting places it there, while some English sources date the exclusive shift as late as 1956, Corbeil began focusing on a specific kind of body, the school bus. The yellow school bus was itself a recent invention in standardized form. The color, National School Bus. Glossy yellow, formally adopted at a 1939 conference hosted by Columbia University's Frank Cyr, had been chosen because black lettering against that particular shade of chrome yellow was the most legible combination at dawn and dusk when children were most likely to be boarding. The bus was an American innovation, but it crossed the border almost immediately, and by the early 1940s, Quebec's rural school commissions were buying them in growing numbers as the province consolidated its scattered one-room schoolhouses into larger regional schools. Joseph-Henri Corbeil saw the opportunity the way a farmer reads weather. Not through data, but through instinct refined by proximity. Rural Quebec needed buses. Rural Quebec had terrible roads and brutal winters. And rural Quebec was underserved by the Anglophone manufacturers in Ontario, who dominated the market. A Francophone builder in the Lanaudière, who understood the local conditions, who could talk to the school commissions in their own language and deliver a bus that could handle a February morning on an unpaved concession road. That man had a market. He built. He delivered. He earned a reputation. The business grew the way small Quebec enterprises grew in that era. Steadily, without fanfare, through relationships and repeat orders, and the slow accumulation of trust that comes from a product that works when the temperature drops to -30 and the road hasn't been plowed since Tuesday. Joseph-Henri Corbeil died in 1960. He left behind a company, a name, and 3 sons. Chapter 2. The Bluebird cage control of J.H. Corbeil passed to the 3 brothers, Michel among them. What followed was something closer to a transformation than a transition. The sons didn't simply maintain what their father had built. They expanded it with an ambition that would have been difficult to imagine in the original shop. By the late 1960s, J.H. Corbeil had captured roughly 65% of the school bus body market in Quebec and Eastern Canada. 65%. In a province where Anglophone firms had historically dominated manufacturing, a Francophone family operation from a tobacco village now controlled nearly 2/3 of the buses carrying children to school across the eastern half of the country. They built a larger plant next to their father's original building, scaled up production, and established themselves as the name in Quebec school transportation. The timing mattered. The 1960s in Quebec were the Quiet Revolution, the decade when French Canadians seized control of their own institutions, their own economy, their own political destiny. Jean Lesage's Liberals swept to power in 1960 on the slogan Maître chez nous, masters in our own house, and the transformation that followed touched every corner of Quebec life. Hydro-Quebec was nationalized. The education system was overhauled. Francophone business was celebrated, promoted, supported as a matter of cultural survival. The Corbeil brothers, building buses in St-Lin for Quebec's newly consolidated school system, weren't just running a business. They were, whether they thought of it that way or not, part of the proof that the revolution was working. And then, in 1975, they sold. The buyer was Bluebird Corporation, the American school bus giant, operating through its Canadian division. The Corbeil family's enterprise became Bluebird Quebec, and the factory in St-Lin continued under new ownership, American ownership, building buses under an American name in a province that had spent 15 years fighting to control its own economy. The reasons for the sale aren't fully documented in the surviving record. Whether it was the lure of capital, the pressure of competition, the difficulty of scaling further without the resources of a continental manufacturer, the Corbeil brothers made their calculation and signed. It was the kind of decision that repeats across Canadian industrial history with the regularity of a shift change. A successful local enterprise reaches a certain size, and the only buyer with the capital to take it further is American. The pattern is older than Confederation. What happened next was also familiar. Bluebird ran the St-Lin operation through the late 1970s, and then the early 1980s recession arrived. The deepest downturn since the Depression, with interest rates that climbed past 20% and a manufacturing sector that contracted across the country. Bluebird made the branch plant calculation that Canadian workers had learned to expect: consolidate. The St-Lin factory was closed. Operations were folded into the company's Canadian facility near Brantford, Ontario. The plant that Joseph-Henri Corbeil had built, that his sons had grown to dominance, went dark. The buses stopped. The workers dispersed. The building sat empty in a village that had never had much besides farming and a historic site. If this were a simpler story, it would end here, a footnote in the long catalog of Canadian manufacturing absorbed by American capital, and then discarded when the numbers stopped working. But Michel Corbeil was still in St-Lin, and Michel Corbeil wasn't finished. Chapter 3, 77. Buses. 3 years passed. The factory sat. Michel Corbeil watched it sit. The building his father had started in, the floor where he and his brothers had built their 65%, now locked and cold and belonging to an American corporation that had already moved on. In 1985, Michel Corbeil bought it back. He purchased the shuttered factory, assembled a group of business partners, and founded a new company, Les Entreprises Michel Corbeil, Incorporé. The name was deliberate, not J.H. Corbeil. That era was over. This was Michel's company, Michel's risk, Michel's name above the door. He was 49 years old. He was starting over in a 7,000 square foot factory in a village that most Quebecers couldn't find on a map. That first year, Les Entreprises Michel Corbeil built 77 school bus bodies. 77. You could fit 77 buses into a single corner of the lot where a large dealership parks its inventory. It was a modest number by any measure, a fraction of what the family operation had produced in its heyday under the suns, a rounding error compared to what Bluebird or its competitors were turning out in their American plants. But each of those 77 buses was a Type A body mounted on a commercial cutaway van chassis, built in St-Lin by local hands, and sold to a school board that needed a short bus for a route too small or too winding for a full-size conventional. The Type A school bus, what most people call the short bus, was Michel Corbeil's niche, and it was a shrewd one. The full-size school bus market in North America was dominated by massive manufacturers. Bluebird, Thomas Built, the international affiliated operations that would become IC Corporation. Competing with them head-on, from a 7,000-square-foot shop in rural Quebec, would have been suicide. But the Type A was a different market. These were smaller buses, built on cutaway chassis supplied by Ford, General Motors, International, and later Freightliner. The bus maker didn't need to engineer a chassis from scratch, only to design and build the body that went on top of it. That body had to meet stringent federal motor vehicle safety standards and the CSA D250 school bus standard. But the barrier to entry was lower than for full-size buses, and the market was large enough to sustain a specialist. Michel Corbeil was that specialist. His buses used lightweight components and flexible floor plans. They were engineered for Canadian conditions in a way that his competitors, building in Ohio or Indiana or Georgia, couldn't match without trying, because the man designing them had spent his life in a place where winter started in November and didn't relent until April, where the roads cracked and heaved with every freeze-thaw cycle, where a bus that couldn't start at -30 was a bus that left children standing at the side of a road in the dark. Demand grew. By the late 1980s, the 7,000-square-foot shop was no longer adequate. Corbeil moved production to a new facility, 130,000 square feet, nearly 20 times the size of the restart factory. The company that had begun with 77 buses was scaling towards something its founder's father would have recognized as ambition on a continental level. In 1990, Corbeil introduced dual rear-wheel Type A buses, adding the stability and payload capacity that larger school districts required. The following year, the company made its boldest move yet, the EMC First Premier, a full-size school bus built on International 3800 and Ford B800 chassis. For the first time since the Bluebird years, St-Lin was producing conventional school buses, the big yellow buses that carry 40, 50, 60 children at a time, the ones that define the morning ritual of every school day in North America. In 1993 came the EMC 3900, sharing a chassis platform with the Amtran Genesis. In 1995, a change that would prove more enduring than any engineering innovation. The company replaced its vertical EMC logo with a new emblem, a stylized smiley face set into the roofline above the windshield, grinning down at the children boarding below. The first Premier was renamed the Corbeil Conventional, and the smiley face became the company's signature. It was cheerful, distinctive, and immediately recognizable, a small touch of personality on a vehicle that most manufacturers treated as purely functional. Parents noticed it, children noticed it, bus drivers noticed it. In an industry where differentiation was measured in inches of steel and fractions of a cent per mile, the smiley face was worth more than any spec sheet. Between 1994 and 1998, Corbeil entered a joint venture with Carpenter Industries of Indiana to produce single rear-wheel buses, extending the company's reach into the American Midwest's dealer networks. The partnership was notable, a Quebec family operation collaborating with an established American manufacturer, but it also exposed a vulnerability that would shape Corbeil's future. American Transportation Corporation, International's bus-building arm known as Amtran, blocked Corbeil from selling its full-size conventional buses in the United States. Amtran was protecting its own product line, and it had the market power to enforce the exclusion. Corbeil could sell its Type A buses across the border, but its full-size ambitions were hemmed in at the 49th parallel. The message was clear. The American market wanted Corbeil's small buses, but not its big ones. Michel Corbeil adjusted. He concentrated on what the border would let through: the Type A, the short bus, the vehicle that had built the company from 77 units to a serious continental player. It was a pragmatic decision. It would also prove to be a fateful one, because it locked the company's future to a single product category, and increasingly, to a single foreign market. Chapter 4. The Smiley Face on the Roof. By the early 2000s, the Corbeil factory in St-Lin-Laurentides had settled into the rhythm of a plant that knows exactly what it does and does it well. The 130,000 square foot building sat at 830 12 Vies Avenue, a modern industrial structure in a town that still felt more agricultural than anything else, surrounded by the flat, open farmland of the Lanaudière, with Montreal's skyline invisible beyond the southern horizon. In winter, the parking lot filled before dawn, headlights cutting through the dark as workers arrived from across the region, from Joliette, from Repentigny, from Rawdon and L'Assomption, and the dozens of small communities scattered through the countryside north of the St. Lawrence. Inside, the process began with a bare chassis. A Ford E450 cutaway perhaps, or a GM 3500, or an International. The cab and frame and engine already complete, driven or trailered to St-Lin from the chassis manufacturer's own plant. What Corbeil built was everything behind the cab: the body, the structure, the interior, the bus itself. Steel framing was cut and welded into the skeletal shape of the body. Lightweight panels were fitted to the frame, designed to keep the total weight low enough that the commercial chassis could handle it without straining. Insulation went in, and in a Corbeil bus, the insulation mattered more than it did in a bus built in Alabama or Kansas, because these bodies were engineered for a climate where the temperature inside the bus needed to be livable when the temperature outside was 20, 25, 30 degrees below zero. Floors were laid with a flexibility that was one of Corbeil's selling points. The Type A bus serves a range of purposes: regular route school transportation, special needs transport with wheelchair lifts and tie-downs, activity buses for sports teams and field trips, and Corbeil's floor plans could be configured to match. A bus destined for a special needs route in upstate New York might leave the line with wheelchair positions, reduced seating, and reinforced anchor points. A bus headed to a rural Quebec school commission might carry a full complement of small seats for elementary students on a route that wound through 20 kilometers of back roads. The adaptability wasn't accidental. It was the reason school districts chose Corbeil over competitors whose designs were less modular. The paint came last, or nearly last. That specific shade of national school bus glossy yellow that had been the law since the 1939 conference, applied over primer and sealant in a finish that had to survive road salt, gravel spray, UV exposure, and the particular punishment of Canadian frost. And somewhere in the finishing process, the smiley face went on, that roofline emblem grinning from above the windshield, the detail that made a Corbeil immediately identifiable from 100 meters away. Walk through the plant on a production day in 2003 or 2004, and you'd hear the hiss of pneumatic tools, the clang of steel on steel, the whine of cutters shaping panels to template. You'd smell primer and adhesive and the sharp, clean scent of freshly cut metal. You'd hear French, almost entirely French, the Québécois French of the Lanaudière, spoken fast and clipped over the noise of the line, punctuated by the vocabulary of the trade: châssis, carrosserie, soudure, plancher. This wasn't a bilingual factory floor in the manner of a Montreal aerospace plant where English and French mixed freely. This was a francophone workplace in a francophone town in a francophone region, and the language of the work was the language of the place. About 205 people worked at the Corbeil plant at its peak, and most of them lived within driving distance, close enough that the factory wasn't just an employer, but a fixture, a presence in the economic life of the Lanaudière, the way a mill is a presence in a river valley, or a mine is a presence in a northern town. Not dominant in the way that a single industry company town depends on its plant, St-Lin had other employment, other reasons for existing, but significant. 205 paychecks, every 2 weeks, circulating through the gas stations and dépanneurs and grocery stores of the surrounding communities. 205 families whose mortgages and car payments and children's hockey registration fees depended on the continued production of yellow school buses in a building on 12 East Avenue. Chapter 5. Across the Border. The buses that rolled out of St-Lin didn't stay in Quebec, not most of them anyway. By the mid-2000s, roughly 75% of Corbeil's sales were crossing the border into the United States. 75%. 3 out of every 4 buses built in that Launaudière factory were destined for American school districts, American children, American roads. The company's largest dealers were both in New York State, Don Brown Bus Sales in Johnstown and Gorman Enterprises in Elma, small city dealerships that moved Corbeil Type A buses into school systems across the Northeast. The American appetite for Corbeil's product made geographic and engineering sense. The U.S. Northeast shares Quebec's climate in broad terms: the cold, the snow, the road salt, the freeze-thaw cycles that destroy equipment not designed to withstand them. A bus engineered for a February morning in St-Lin performed beautifully on a February morning in Syracuse, or Albany, or Burlington. The lightweight construction that kept the buses nimble on Quebec's secondary roads translated directly to the winding rural routes of upstate New York and northern New England. And the flexible floor plans that Quebec school commissions valued were equally prized by American districts juggling regular routes, special needs transport, and extracurricular runs with limited budgets. The dependency that developed was profound and, for a time, invisible. When your product is good and your market is hungry, the fact that 3/4 of your revenue comes from a single foreign country doesn't feel like a vulnerability. It feels like success. Annual revenue climbed. At its peak, the company reached 75 million Canadian dollars, a remarkable figure for a family-founded operation in a town of fewer than 20,000 people, building a niche product in a specialized corner of the transportation industry. The reach extended beyond New York. Corbeil buses operated across the northeastern United States and throughout eastern Canada, from the Maritimes through Ontario. The smiley face on the roofline became one of the most recognized manufacturer emblems in the school transportation industry, not because of an advertising campaign or a branding consultancy, but because of repetition. If you drove the rural highways of Quebec or Ontario or upstate New York in the mid-2000s, and you saw a short yellow school bus, there was a better than 1 in 5 chance it was a Corbeil. The emblem accrued meaning through presence. It was the face of the bus that carried your children. And in St-Lin-Laurentides, the factory's presence meant something beyond paychecks and property taxes. It meant that a village once known primarily for tobacco farming, and Wilfrid Laurier's birthplace, had a second identity, a manufacturing identity, a productive identity, a reason for young people to stay in the region rather than making the 40-kilometer commute to Montreal's northern suburbs for work. The Corbeil plant didn't transform St-Lin into an industrial city, but it gave the town a stake in an industry that mattered, a connection to a continental supply chain, a product that people outside the Launaudière had heard of and respected. Michel Corbeil himself remained central to the operation. He'd founded the company in 1985, restarted it from the shell of his father's legacy, and built it over 2 decades into a continental player. His wife, Suzanne Monahan, was part of the family fabric. His brother, Pierre Paul, remained connected to the enterprise and the community. This was not an absentee ownership story, not a branch plant controlled from a distant boardroom. The man whose name was on the building lived in St-Lin. The decisions were made in the Launaudière, not in Kansas or Detroit or Toronto. The management team reflected that proximity. Camille Chartrand served as CEO, a man whose career in school bus manufacturing ran so deep that colleagues would later credit him with having supervised the fabrication of roughly 60,000 buses over the course of his working life. Marc Bédard, a former PwC partner, sat on the Corbeil board for approximately 15 years, bringing financial and strategic expertise to a company that was growing faster than its village origins might have predicted. These were people who knew the product, knew the market, and knew each other. The company ran on expertise and relationships, not on corporate hierarchy. Chapter 6. 22%. In 2006, 7 assemblers sold 8,600 small school buses across Canada and the United States. Corbeil's share was 1,947 units, 22% of the entire North American Type A market. 1 in 5 short buses sold on the continent came from a single plant in a Quebec village that most Canadians had never heard of. That year, the company's revenue was $57 million. It had been higher, $75 million at the peak. But $57 million was still formidable for what the operation was. Not a multinational, not a division of a conglomerate. A family-founded, privately held, francophone manufacturer in the Lanaudière, employing 205 people and competing head-to-head with American builders who had the advantages of scale, proximity to their domestic market, and a currency that had spent most of the previous 2 decades making Canadian exports cheap for American buyers. That currency advantage was the foundation beneath Corbeil's American success, and it had been so reliable for so long that it had become invisible, the way a foundation always is, until it cracks. For most of the 1990s and into the early 2000s, the Canadian dollar had traded well below the American, hovering around 65-70 cents US through much of the period, and plunging to a modern record low of 62 cents US in January 2002. At that exchange rate, a Corbeil bus that cost a certain number of Canadian dollars to produce was remarkably affordable for an American school district paying in US currency. The price advantage wasn't marginal, it was structural. It was, in effect, a subsidy that no government had legislated and no trade agreement had negotiated. A gift from the foreign exchange market that made a Quebec manufacturer competitive on price, even when American competitors could claim lower labor costs and shorter supply lines. And in 2006, standing at 22% of the market, with $57 million in revenue and 205 workers on the floor, Corbeil looked like exactly what its champions said it was: a fleuron, a jewel of Quebec manufacturing, proof that a francophone family enterprise could compete at a continental level in a market dominated by American firms. The smiley face was everywhere. The dealers in New York were moving inventory. The plant was full, but the dollar was moving. It had been moving for 4 years, climbing from that 62-cent floor in 2002, with a steadiness that reflected Canada's resource boom, its fiscal surpluses, and the growing confidence of international markets in the Canadian economy. By 2006, the looney, the common name Canadians give their dollar coin, after the loon engraved on its face, was approaching 90 cents US. For Corbeil, every cent the looney gained against the American dollar was a cent added to the effective price of every bus sold south of the border. The school districts in New York and New England and the Midwest that had been buying Corbeil Type A buses at an exchange rate discount were seeing those discounts erode month by month, quarter by quarter. At the same time, the competitive landscape was tightening. Bluebird had introduced its Vision model in 2003, and Thomas Built had launched the SAF T-Liner C2 the same year, both full-size buses on proprietary chassis that represented a new generation of integrated design. IC Corporation had begun selling full-size buses in Canada in 2004, invading the niche that Corbeil's discontinued conventional had once occupied. The discontinuation of the International 3800 chassis after the 2004 model year had already forced Corbeil to abandon its full-size line entirely, narrowing the company's product range to the Type A buses that were its strength, but also, increasingly, its only card. The full-size North American school bus market had contracted from 7 manufacturers in 1990 to just 3 by 2000. The consolidation was relentless, and it was moving toward the Type A segment. Corbeil's competitors weren't standing still. But in St-Lin, in 2006, the buses were still rolling off the line. The orders were still coming in. The smiley face was still going on the roof, and the foundation, the exchange rate that had made all of it possible, was still holding. It wouldn't hold for much longer. Chapter 7. The looney takes flight. The Canadian dollar didn't announce what it was about to do. It simply climbed. From that record low of 62 cents US in January 2002, the looney rose with the patience of something geological. Not a spike, not a crisis, but a steady, grinding appreciation driven by forces that had nothing to do with school buses and everything to do with oil sands, commodity prices, fiscal discipline, and the growing appetite of global capital for Canadian assets. Through 2003, 2004, 2005, the currency gained ground a cent or two at a time, each increment too small to provoke alarm on its own, each one quietly adding to the bill that Corbeil's American customers would eventually have to pay. The arithmetic was brutal in its simplicity. A Type A school bus body that cost Corbeil a given number of Canadian dollars to manufacture in St-Lin was priced for American buyers in U.S. currency. When the looney sat at 62 cents, that Canadian cost translated to a deeply competitive American price. The exchange rate functioned as a discount of nearly 40% that no American competitor could match without slashing its own margins. But as the dollar climbed, the discount shrank. At 70 cents, it was still substantial. At 80 cents, it was eroding. At 90 cents, it was nearly gone. And at parity, $1 Canadian equal to $1 American dollar, the discount vanished entirely. And every structural disadvantage that the exchange rate had been masking was suddenly, nakedly visible. The higher Canadian labor costs, the longer shipping distances from rural Quebec to school districts in New York and Ohio and Michigan, the border itself with its paperwork and customs delays, and the particular friction of doing business across a national boundary. La Presse would later calculate that by 2007, a Canadian-made product effectively cost an American buyer roughly 57% more than it had in 2003. 57%. Not a marginal increase, a transformation. The bus that had been the best value in the Type A market 4 years earlier was now, through no change in its quality or design or the skill of the workers who built it, among the most expensive. The currency didn't move in isolation. Quebec's entire manufacturing sector was bleeding. Statistics Canada data show the province lost approximately 86,700 manufacturing jobs between 2004 and 2008, a hemorrhage concentrated in the export-dependent sectors that had thrived under the weak dollar. The transport equipment sector, which exported 73% of its output, was the most exposed segment of all. Corbeil, with 75% of its sales in the United States, sat squarely in the path of that exposure. And the competitive pressure wasn't just monetary. The American Type A market was consolidating the way the full-size market had consolidated a decade earlier. Collins Bus Corporation, based in South Hutchinson, Kansas, had been building Type A buses since the late 1960s and had established itself as a pioneer of the segment. In 1998, Collins had acquired Mid-Bus of Bluffton, Ohio, absorbing a competitor and expanding its dealer network. The American manufacturers were getting bigger. Their costs were denominated in US dollars. They didn't have an exchange rate eating into their margins with every quarterly earnings report. Meanwhile, the chassis supply that Corbeil depended on was narrowing. The discontinuation of the International 3800 after model year 2004 had already killed the Corbeil conventional. Now the remaining chassis options, Ford, GM, Freightliner, were the same platforms available to every other Type A builder on the continent. The differentiation that Corbeil could offer was in its body design, its winter engineering, its flexible floor plans. But differentiation only matters when the price is competitive. When your product costs 57% more than it did 4 years ago, differentiation becomes a luxury your customers can no longer afford. Inside the Corbeil plant, the effects arrived gradually. Orders that had been routine became harder to close. Dealers in New York reported that school districts were looking at American-built alternatives, not because the Corbeil product was worse, but because the budget was the budget, and the budget was denominated in US dollars. The revenue line told the story in aggregate, from 75 million Canadian dollars at the peak to 57 million by 2006. An $18 million decline, 24% of peak revenue, and the dollar was still climbing. Nobody in St-Lin could stop it. Nobody in Ottawa was trying. The strong Canadian dollar was celebrated in the financial press as a sign of national economic health, a validation of Canada's resource wealth and fiscal prudence. For the workers on 12 East Avenue, that celebration had the sound of applause at someone else's party. Chapter 8. The calculation that couldn't be solved. The final year began with numbers that no longer worked. By the spring of 2007, Camille Chartrand, the CEO who had spent decades in the school bus industry, the man credited with supervising the fabrication of some 60,000 buses over the course of his career, was facing a set of facts that admitted no solution within the company's existing model. 75% of revenue depended on U.S. sales. The U.S. dollar was approaching parity with the Canadian. The cost structure of the St-Lin operation, the labor, the materials, the overhead of a 130,000 square foot plant, was fixed in Canadian dollars that were now worth, to American buyers, almost exactly as much as their own currency. The price advantage that had underpinned 2 decades of cross-border success had evaporated, and it wasn't coming back. The decision-makers in American school districts didn't need to be hostile to Corbeil. They didn't need to prefer American products for patriotic reasons or resent a Canadian manufacturer. They simply needed to buy the bus that fit the budget. And the budget, in district after district across the Northeast, no longer fit a Corbeil. Chartrand would tell Canadian media afterward that the company was no longer competitive with American manufacturers. The phrasing was restrained, the Quebecois understatement of a man who understood the situation precisely and saw no purpose in dramatizing it. The company wasn't failing because its product had deteriorated. It wasn't failing because its workers had lost their skill or its management had lost its way. It was failing because a macroeconomic force, the appreciation of a national currency, had repriced its entire business out of the market it depended on. The question was whether to keep operating at a loss in the hope that the dollar would retreat, or to stop. There was no government rescue on the table, no provincial intervention from the riding of Rousseau, no federal lifeline from the riding of Montcalm, no public campaign to save the plant, no emergency loan, no wage subsidy to bridge the gap until the exchange rate turned. The political response to Corbeil's crisis, if there was one, exists only in local newspapers that have never been digitized. The weeklies of the Lanaudière, L'Action, and Hebdo Rive Nord, and La Revue, whose pages may contain the words of a mayor, or a member of the National Assembly, or a local organizer who tried to do something. But in the digital record, there is silence. A 205-person factory in a small Quebec town did not command the political attention that a GM plant in Oshawa or a steel mill in Hamilton would have drawn. And across the border, someone was watching. Collins Bus Corporation had been founded in 1967 by Don Collins Sr., originally as Econo Conversion in Kansas City, Missouri, a company that converted commercial vans into small buses. Renamed Collins Industries in 1971, relocated to Hutchinson, Kansas in 1972, the company had grown into one of the largest Type A school bus manufacturers in the United States. Its acquisition of Midbus in 1998 had already demonstrated a pattern: buy competitors, absorb their production, consolidate the market. Collins was, by 2007, a company with the capital and the appetite to expand. And Corbeil, a wounded competitor with a strong product line, an established dealer network, and a brand that meant something in Quebec, Ontario, and the U.S. Northeast, was exactly the kind of acquisition that a consolidator looks for. The ownership structure behind Collins itself had been churning. Since October 2006, the company had been 80% owned by B&S Holding Inc., with American industrial partners holding the remainder. Collins was not a family enterprise answering to its founders' values. It was a financial asset answering to its investors' returns. The calculation it made about Corbeil was the calculation such entities always make. What are the assets worth? What can we absorb? What can we discard? The sequence of events in the summer and autumn of 2007 compressed what might have been a longer decline into a few devastating weeks. The 205 employees left their jobs on August 24, 2007. The shutdown was publicly confirmed in mid to late September. There was no phased wind-down, no gradual reduction in shifts, no year of diminishing production while management searched for alternatives. The workers walked out in August. By September, it was over. A re-employment committee, a comité de reclassement, the Quebec mechanism for helping displaced workers find new positions, was established. Some workers found their way to Nova Bus in Saint-Eustache, the transit bus manufacturer that was recruiting at the time. Others scattered into the regional labor market, carrying skills in welding, assembly, finishing, and quality control that had been honed building school buses, and now had to find new applications in a Lanaudière economy that hadn't needed to absorb 205 displaced manufacturing workers at once in living memory. On September 27, 2007, barely a month after the workers had left, Collins Industries announced it had purchased the select assets of Les Entreprises Michel Corbeil for an undisclosed price. Not the factory, not the workforce, not the community's stake in the enterprise. The assets, the designs, the tooling, the naming rights, the warranties, the things that could be moved, the things that had value detached from the place that had created them. Randall Swift, president and CEO of Collins Industries, said the acquisition gave Collins a significant platform to continue our growth in the Type A bus market. Kent Tyler, president of Collins Bus Corp, said it should send a clear message to our dealers and customers of our commitment to this industry. The language was the language of corporate growth, platforms, commitments, clear messages. It said nothing about the 205 people in the Lanaudière who had just lost their jobs, or about the 70-year trajectory of a family enterprise that had begun with truck bodies in 1936, or about the founder's name now belonging to a Kansas corporation. The looney, as if delivering a final verdict, reached parity with the US dollar on September 20, 2007, 1 week before the Collins deal was signed. It would peak intraday at approximately $1.10 US on November 7, 2007, closing near $1.08. The currency that had been Corbeil's invisible subsidy had become its executioner, and it reached its most lethal level at the precise moment the company was being sold for parts. Chapter 9. The name on the Kansas bus Collins moved quickly. All Corbeil production was transferred to Kansas. Simultaneously, Collins closed its own mid-bus plant in Bluffton, Ohio, the competitor it had acquired in 1998, consolidating everything into the South Hutchinson facility. The first American-made buses carrying Corbeil designs rolled off the Kansas line before the end of 2007. The speed of the transfer tells you what Collins valued. Not the factory, not the workforce, not the location. The designs, the brand, the dealer relationships, the things you can put on a truck. In Kansas, the Corbeil name lived on, but as a regional brand, not a company. The Collins Bantam was marketed as the Corbeil Quantum, sold primarily in Quebec, Ontario, and New England, the markets where the Corbeil name still carried weight with school boards that had been buying smiley face buses for 20 years. The name on the side of the bus said Corbeil. The bus was built in Kansas by American workers in an American factory owned by American investors. The smiley face kept grinning. The children kept boarding. Nothing looked different from the outside. Inside the industry, the absorption followed a predictable timeline. The Quantum name was retired in 2012, replaced by the Nexbus. The Corbeil brand itself was phased out around 2016. Collins dropped the Quebec name and marketed everything under its own brand across North America. A 70-year-old family name, Corbeil, the name Joseph Henry had put on truck bodies in 1936, the name Michel had staked his restart on in 1985, the name that had sat above the smiley face on thousands of buses carrying children from Nova Scotia to northern New York, was quietly erased from the product line. No announcement, no ceremony, just a decision made in Kansas that the name no longer served a commercial purpose. The ownership of Collins itself continued to churn in the years that followed, in a cascade that would have bewildered Joseph Henry Corbeil. In 2010, American Industrial Partners combined Collins with Fleetwood, E1, and Halcor into a conglomerate called Allied Specialty Vehicles. Allied became a Rev Group, which went public on the New York Stock Exchange in 2017. Then, in January 2024, Rev Group exited bus manufacturing entirely. selling Collins Bus to Forest River Bus, a subsidiary of Berkshire Hathaway, for $303 million in cash. The company that had absorbed Corbeil's name and designs was itself now on its fourth or fifth set of owners. A financial asset passed from hand to hand with the same indifference to continuity that had characterized every transaction since September 2007. Collins still operates from its approximately 94,000 square foot plant in South Hutchinson. The Corbeil name appears nowhere on its products. The smiley face is gone. Chapter 10. The building on 12E Avenue. The factory still stands. Drive north from Montreal on the Autoroute 15, then east through the Lanaudière, and you'll reach St-Lin-Laurentides, a town that has grown since 2007. Its population swelling with commuters who work in the northern suburbs of the metropolis and sleep in the relative quiet of the countryside. The tobacco fields are mostly gone. The dairy farms persist. The Sir Wilfrid Laurier National Historic Site still receives its visitors. At 830 12E Avenue, the street is also known, in one of those small municipal gestures that preserves a name after everything else has been lost, as Rue J.H. Corbeil, the 131,000 square foot building that Michel Corbeil filled with bus production, now houses Composites VCI. Le Groupe Composites VCI Incas is a composite materials manufacturer serving the energy, aerospace, and transport sectors. They employ around 85 people. The building is clean, maintained, operational. It is not a ruin in the traditional sense, not the broken windows and birch saplings through concrete of a Cape Breton steel mill or a Northern Ontario pulp plant. It is a building that found a second use. But walk through the parking lot and count the cars. 85 where 205 once parked. The scale of what the building contained has contracted. The product that gave it meaning, the yellow buses with the smiley face that rolled out of those doors and onto the highways of two countries, is gone from the premises entirely. Composites VCI makes good products for serious industries, but they don't make school buses. The children of the Lanaudière ride to school on buses built somewhere else, by someone else, without the emblem that their parents would have recognized. Michel Corbeil died on July 11, 2011, in St-Lin-Laurentides. He was 75 years old. His obituary named his wife, Suzanne Monahan, and his surviving brother, Pierre-Paul Corbeil. It did not dwell on the company, or the collapse, or the Kansas transaction. He died in the town where his father had started building truck bodies in the Depression, where he himself had restarted a bus company from a shuttered factory at the age of 49, and where the building that carried his family's name now manufactured something else entirely. The 205 workers scattered into a regional economy that absorbed them unevenly. Some went to Nova Bus in Saint-Eustache, carrying their skills across to transit buses. A different product, a different market, but the same fundamental competence of cutting and welding and fitting a body to a chassis. Others left manufacturing altogether. The Comité de Reclassement did its work in the way these committees do, helping with resumes, connecting people to retraining programs, facilitating introductions to employers who needed welders or assemblers or quality inspectors. The individual outcomes are mostly undocumented. 205 people re-entered the labor market in a province that was losing manufacturing jobs at a rate of nearly 22,000 per year. Some landed well, some didn't. The record doesn't say. The broader Canadian school bus manufacturing landscape that Corbeil left behind contracted further. After the closure, Girardin Minibus in Drummondville was for a time the sole remaining Canadian small bus maker. In 2009, Girardin partnered with Bluebird in the Microbird joint venture, creating a binational arrangement that kept some production in Quebec, but within the orbit of an American parent, the branch plant pattern reasserting itself in a new form. Chapter 11. The Lion in the Room. There is a coda to this story, and it is as Quebecois as the story itself. In 2008, 1 year after the Corbeil shutdown, two men from the Corbeil orbit founded a new company. Marc Bédard, the former PwC partner who had served roughly 15 years on the Corbeil board, who had known Michel Corbeil personally, who understood both the promise and the vulnerability of building buses in Quebec. joined forces with Camille Chartrand, the CEO who had steered Corbeil through its final years and who carried, in his experience, the accumulated knowledge of 60,000 buses. Together, they founded Autobus Lion, based in Saint-Jérôme, about 60 kilometers west of St-Lin in the Laurentides. Bédard would later tell Topo Local what Chartrand's experience meant. Camille a probablement supervisé la fabrication d'environ 60 000 bus scolaires dans sa vie. C'était un complice précieux. A precious accomplice. The word complice carries weight in French that its English cognate doesn't quite capture. It suggests a partnership forged in shared risk, shared knowledge, shared stakes. These weren't corporate acquaintances launching a startup. They were men who had watched a company die and were determined to build something from what they'd learned. Lion began with better materials and conventional drivetrains, but its bet, the bet that would define the company, was on electrification. By the mid-2010s, Lion had positioned itself as North America's electric school bus pioneer, building zero-emission buses in Quebec for school districts across the continent. The company went public in May 2021 through a SPAC merger on the NYSE and the TSX, in a deal that generated approximately $200 million in net IPO proceeds and roughly $490 million from the broader combination. A Quebec school bus company, born from the ashes of Corbeil, was trading on the New York Stock Exchange. The redemptive arc wrote itself. And then, with the symmetry that history sometimes offers and fiction wouldn't dare attempt, Lion faltered. The company had overexpanded. Too many models, too many markets, too much ambition funded by too much debt. On December 19, 2024, Lion entered creditor protection under the Companies Creditors Arrangement Act, with the Superior Court of Quebec appointing Deloitte as monitor. A Quebec-led investor group, Vincent Chiara, Pierre Wilkie, and Claude Boivin, moved to rescue the company by refocusing solely on school buses and repatriating production to Saint-Jérôme after the Quebec government declined to provide further funding. A Quebec bus maker, founded by people who had watched Corbeil collapse, undone again. This time, not by the dollar, but by debt and demand. The founder's ghost, the currency, the American market, the scale problem, the structural fragility of building specialized vehicles in a small northern economy for a continental market that doesn't need you to survive. The pattern recurs with the insistence of a shift whistle, calling the same workers to the same floor to learn the same lesson one more time. The Lion story was still unfolding as of the spring of 2026. Its outcome remained uncertain. Whether the rescue would hold, whether the buses would keep rolling out of Saint-Jérôme, whether the electric future that Bédard and Chartrand had staked their second act on would survive its own crisis. These were open questions, carried forward by a new generation of workers and investors and politicians into a future that owed more to Michel Corbeil's 77 buses than most of them would ever know. Chapter 12. Just the Quiet. The school buses still run in the Lanaudière. They run in Quebec and Ontario and New York and New England. Every morning, in the dark of a Canadian autumn, or the deeper dark of a Canadian winter, yellow buses with headlights burning pull onto roads that haven't been plowed yet and stop at the ends of driveways where children stand with their backpacks and their breath freezing in the air. The buses are warm inside. The drivers know the routes. The children climb aboard, and the doors close, and the bus moves on to the next stop. And nobody, not the driver, not the children, not the parents watching from the kitchen window, thinks about where the bus was built, or by whom, or what happened to the factory that made it. The smiley face is gone from the roofline. The Corbeil name is gone from the body. The designs that Michel Corbeil's team drew and the engineering that his workers refined through 20 years of Quebec winters now live inside buses built in South Hutchinson, Kansas, by a company owned by Berkshire Hathaway. And no marking on the finished product connects it to a small factory on 12 Avenue in St-Lin-Laurentides, where a man restarted his father's business at the age of 49 and spent 2 decades proving it could work. What remains is the building, repurposed, the name on a street sign, an obituary from 2011, a currency chart that tells the story more precisely than any narrative could. a line climbing from 62 cents to $1.10 over 5 years, carrying a 70-year-old family enterprise over a cliff that nobody in the factory had the power to see coming or the leverage to avoid. And the children on the buses. Riding to school the way Canadian children have ridden to school for 80 years, in yellow buses that look the same as they always have, built to the same federal standards, painted the same national school bus glossy yellow that Frank Cyr chose in 1939 because it was the most visible color at dawn. They don't know about Michel Corbeil. They don't know about the 77 buses. They don't know that the vehicle they're sitting in carries the ghost of a Quebec family's ambition and a Kansas corporation's appetite, and a currency that rose, and a factory that fell, and 205 people who went home one August afternoon and didn't come back. They just ride to school. The bus is warm, the road is cold. And in St-Lin-Laurentides, the building on 12e Avenue stands in the winter light. Occupied, functional, quiet. Just the quiet.